I know we probably have some parents attending. Obviously, this is geared definitely to parents who want to help support their students, but then students as well. So I know we're recording. We're going to be able to share this out. We did have, sorry, this is not the screen I'm looking for. Here we go. We did have a previous session, kind of just mapping out a roadmap for successful prep for ACT and SAT. I have the slides from that presentation attached at the bottom of the current slides from today. So if you weren't able to attend that, or there's still some lingering questions about logistics or formats and whatnot, that's going to be, I'll just kind of keep that included at the bottom of this slide deck here. Today, we're jumping in to talk about how to be successful on the actual test. So when Amanda and I were putting this plan together, we were thinking it would be really great just to give everyone some down and dirty tips and strategies. That's what this is all about. I am going to do a quick intro just for those of you who don't know me. I'm local as well. I've got 3 teams here in the Downers Grove area. I specialize in executive functioning and neurodiversity. So I do a lot of work with students who learn in all different types of ways. And then also, really kind of digging into the test prep component, but keeping all of that in mind. So there's a couple different facets to what we do, but I've been doing ACT and SAT prep for probably about 20 years or so now. And I'm going to do a quick recap. I can get this to advance. I'm not going to read these slides. This was from our previous presentation, but obviously the 2 major standardized tests that we're working with, typically junior year, fall of senior year, are the ACT and the SAT. And in our last presentation, which I also think we recorded, so we can get that link back out, we did talk a lot about the differences between the tests. Format-wise, I'm just going to highlight that they're pretty similar these days. The ACT has English, math, reading, and science. The science is not really science, which we'll talk about. The SAT test, it has 3 core sections. The math is kind of split into a couple. So it has a reading section, a writing and language, and then a heavier math section. And the math section is split into calculator, no calculator, and then it's split into multiple choice and then free response, where they actually write their numbers and bubble in kind of their responses, which is not on the ACT. It's all multiple choice. There is not a science section on the SAT, but they do put their science and reasoning and some graphs and tables into their reading section. So when I say the tests are similar, they're a lot more similar than they ever were way back when, if you're a parent watching this, you and I were taking these tests. So what we're going to do today is all strategy. I usually do a lot of one-on-one prep, occasionally small groups, but I really want to focus on kind of down and dirty. What are the things that if we learn and implement and kind of shift and adjust to are really going to give us the biggest bang for our buck and make a big impact on that score. So couple things. I'm going to go through a few bullet points. I'm going to break all of the bullet point rules of slides just so that you guys have the information in one place. Preparation, obviously doing something. We're not talking about thousands of hours worth of work. Just get prepared in some way, do some practice tests, learn some strategies, make yourself a study guide. The one big thing I encourage students to do is to be okay with shifting your approach and how you actually take the test. It's a little bit uncomfortable, and we'll talk about that as we kind of move through the strategies, but it's really best to figure out how to manage a test like this, and then also figure out what are, I put ACT, but SAT as well, what are the rules that you need to follow for this particular test? Not something that not the rules you've applied throughout your schooling and education and tests in your classes. The goal here is to get behind the minds of the people who wrote the test. So in order to figure out the test, we got to figure out what they want, and then we got to give it to them. We're looking for patterns in the question, patterns in the different types of answer choices that are presented, and then patterns in the correct responses, meaning what are they looking for? Let's find some ways to get that to them. They really do want you to say things in the most direct and concise way. So we'll talk about that as just a strategy on its own in a few minutes. Mindset's a big part of it. I have a lot of students that I've worked with where mindset is kind of that very top level factor. If we're not in the right mindset, if we're really negative, we don't feel good about the test, anxiety gets in the way, that can really kind of set the tone for how the entire test goes. And students who scored really well on a practice can kind of not perform so well on that actual day. So I really want students to focus on what is that self-talk, how are they going to get themselves in the right mindset, remind and self-coach themselves that they've prepared and they're ready, and kind of stay in that zone as they're taking the test. If they become frustrated, or if you're a student watching, you get frustrated taking it, you get stuck, you're zoning out, or you're slipping back into old habits, try to take a pause and just reset quickly. Don't get overwhelmed if it's too hard. and remind yourself that it's a lot easier than you think it is, a lot of these questions, especially if you're looking at the prep here, because you'll have all kinds of good strategies to use. So make sure for each of the different sections, you've kind of got a plan as to how you're going to approach it, and then which strategies you're actually going to use and put into place. The hardest part is just practicing a new way of doing things and then making it more of a habit. And then, of course, catching yourself on the test if you're slipping back into your old, like, oh, I'm second guessing and maybe I better look at these other answers because there might be a better choice. Catch yourself right away to like, nope, hang on. What's the strategy? Follow it, apply it, move on. And that's kind of the coaching that you want to do for yourself throughout that test. There is a test prep book that I recommend. I think I have it linked in the math slides. It's just the official ACT prep guide. It's across the room over here, but it's like a giant red book. That's the one I use because it has ACTs that have actually been used previously, and it's written by the writers of the ACT. So it's put out by the ACT organization. It's not made up by a test prep company. And so we will see, and we do see variation in the questions and the way they're written if we're not using test prep or practice tests from the actual company who's putting out the test. There are answer explanations in the back of each test. I don't love those based on kind of what you'll see with the strategies that we're using for every section, but for the math section and the reading section, it can be particularly helpful just to kind of get a feel for what they want. And in math, you can always just kind of look and see how they did the work. They'll show you how they did the work. You don't have to do it that way, but for a lot of the questions, it might just be enough to learn it or to kind of jog your memory on a strategy or something that you had learned in the past. I always advise students to make their own study guide. So from the tips we talk about today to just kind of looking up any of the math concepts in the practice test that they've been going through, make that study guide, put reminders on it, put mindset tips on it, put the rules that you come up with around the test and the questions, get it all on there. And then of course the formulas and the grammar and things that are applicable, just so you have something to study and look over right before going in. And that's when you would use this kind of if-then approach. So you're going to study the approach to each type of question, and you're going to know if it's this kind of question, here's the approach I'm going to use. If it's that kind of question, here's the strategy I'm going to use. And that's how I want you guys to be approaching the actual questions themselves. So that being said, I'm going to jump right in. So I'm going to focus on ACT because the majority of students, when they choose to prep for the ACT, it's just a little bit more consistent and more coachable because the test has been consistent, that we talked about a lot in our first session. All of the strategies we talk about here that I'm highlighting for ACT will apply to the SAT as well. So you should be able to use the same concepts and strategies for that test also. So English section itself. I'm going to show you screenshots, literal screenshots of my handwriting on some of the test questions so that you can get a real feel for what we're talking about here. But big picture wise, let me flip forward. You can kind of see over on the right-hand side, the underlined portion. The English is set up where it's a passage, and then there's just kind of that underlined portion that each question refers to with a little question number underneath it. So we'll go back to that. But in the end, it'll be a passage. You'll get to the underlined part. Most students don't need to kind of read the passage up to that point. There are 5 passages with 15 questions each. You can just go straight to the underlined portion, assess what the prompt or the question is, and then jump in with your strategies for the most part. There are only a few students who really feel like they need to read the entire thing to be able to yield kind of that same result. I always recommend that students mark off, you can write on this test, so mark off the beginning and the end of a sentence with parentheses, because as you're going to reinsert each of the answers that you're testing, it's sometimes really just confusing for your eyes to go back and forth. The beginning of the sentence might start on one page and end on another, or it might have like a giant gap in between it because they try to line the problem number up. It's just kind of frustrating for students. So it'll just make you move a little quicker, and it's less mentally taxing for the first of the 4 subtests if you make a little parenthesis at the beginning and the end, just so you have that visual cue. The English also has a no change option. So letter A often says no change when we're kind of replacing the underlined portion. I really want you to be aware that you don't get thrown by it. Don't try to avoid it. Don't overuse it. Don't try to say to yourself, oh, I'm going to pick this one unless there's something better. We're going to ditch that approach. It might be something that you've used on previous tests. I want you to just pretend that the writers of the test were lazy and they did not want to actually type out the words. Okay, so they were trying to save ink or money, whatever you think. Pretend that what's underlined is actually written over on letter A and just treat it equally as everything else. So when you're skimming the answer choices to kind of see what's different or what they've changed, I want to make sure that you're treating all 4 of them equally. And then the no change, just pretend it's a regular answer. All right, then I've kind of referred to this underlined portion. So we've got two different kinds of questions that they ask on the English or that they include. One of them is the replacement, where you're just replacing the underlined portion. The other one, there's just an actual question that it's asking you. It will make a difference in how you approach it. So I want you to pay very close attention as you move to each question as to whether you're supposed to be replacing the content or if you're just responding to something about like a main idea, or if you're adding or deleting something. And so we'll look at a couple of examples of those. I'm going to shrink there we go. Okay. So replacement questions. The approach in general, so off to the right, I kind of put an example of that. So replacement is just where there's 4 answer choices and then underlined portion, and you're just going to swap it out. The bottom one below that is where there's a question or a prompt in front of it. So the strategies you use are going to be totally different for each of those. With replacement, I want you to skim the answer choices and then ask yourself what's changing. So if we look at number 40 up on the right, what's changing is the pronoun. There's a contraction thrown in there. There's a singular plural scenario, right? So you're kind of categorizing already what rules you need to be calling on. So you're going to ask yourself what's different, and that's going to help you to categorize it. If they're changing commas, you're going to use the comma rule. If the length, which we're going to talk about, if the length of the answer choice is changing, we're going to use a rule about conciseness, and we're going to first apply that rule. Some of the questions are going to be more than one rule that apply. And what you'll do is you'll use one to rule out 2 of the choices, and then you'll be like, okay, I got rid of B and C, but now A and D, what's different is they move the comma. Okay, now I'm going to use my comma rules. So sometimes you'll apply 2 different strategies on one question. For those replacement ones, we're going to have strategies. And then for the question prompt ones, where they've actually asked you a question, the biggest thing on those, and there's a few different kinds that they do, but the 2 biggest tips I can give, obviously I have so much more, but we only have an hour. So I want you to focus on the keywords in the actual question. So if you look at number 43 over to the right, the writer wants to add a detail that emphasizes the rose's ability to survive without human care. So kind of circling, normally I'll have a model where I circle this on here. So you'll circle emphasizes survival without human care. So then we're just going to jump right down to the answer choices, and we're going to find a word that really emphasizes the survival without humans. Okay, so blooming year after abandoned sites. When we see that word abandoned on there, that's going to be the one that connects the most with we don't need humans. It's abandoned. They can grow without. So we're just going to directly connect those ideas. We don't have to go back and read the passage. We can look at, say, letter D, often blooming between mid-spring and fall. That's not letting us know that it has anything to do with survival without human interference, or without human care. So we want to just make sure we're being very literal about those, and you're directly matching the answer choice to the keywords in the question. So that's kind of what that looks like. There are questions that are kind of a yes, no, or an add delete. I can't remember if I put one in here, but it'll be like A and B will be, should the writer add this here? Yes, yes. And then C and D will be no, no. And then they'll give an explanation. This applies to science section, sometimes reading as well. The biggest twist I want to put on that one is don't try to answer the yes or no part first. I know that that's awkward, and most students are like, I got to figure out if it's a yes or no so I can rule 2 of them out. I don't want that to be the concern. I want to look at, just ignore the yes, no, and look at what's behind it. Look at the explanation, because what we can do with that explanation is ask ourselves, is that part they want to add, or is that part they want to delete actually even doing what this explanation says? I don't know that I have an example in here, so hopefully I did. If I did not, when you see the practice test, you'll see those on there. And if it has and it says, should the writer add this? No, because it distracts from the meaning of the paragraph. And if you look at the part that is being added and it has everything to do with the paragraph, it's obviously not distracting you because it fits right in. So you can just get rid of that altogether without worrying about the yes and no component. Here we go. Okay. I'm going to do now the replacement strategies. So I'll give the top 3, I feel like that'll kind of give us the most. And you'll see here in a second what I mean by that. That will give us a chance to get so many more questions correct. So conciseness is number 1. So when we're talking about just the straight replacement and we're assessing the difference between the answer choices, conciseness, and then students, I always just confirm that we're clear on what that means. Short, sweet, to the point. Short and sweet. So the most direct way of saying something is typically the shortest, and that's what the ACT wants. What's uncomfortable is that that's not how we're trained to write. So high school students, if you're sitting here as a high school student, generally speaking, everyone agrees that when you're writing a paper, you're trained to add words, add sentences, make the paragraph longer, add more commas. The ACT wants the exact opposite of that. And so it just takes kind of like a mindset shift to get yourself trained into just being extremely direct and to the point when you're choosing language and then when you're choosing the answer options or the answer choices. So I'll show some examples of that one, but here's the rule. If there's a difference in length and number of actual words in the answer choices, pick the shortest one. If it's letter D, fine, go jump down to letter D. Try the shortest one. Read the sentence beginning to end, always making sure when you put those parentheses in that when you're replacing something, always read beginning to end. That's something I don't know that I directly wrote on here because a lot of students will replace that middle portion and they'll read kind of just before and just after it and be like, oh yeah, that sounds great. But not realizing that had they read it beginning to end, it actually isn't a complete sentence or it does not work. So always when you're doing replacement, read it from beginning to end of the sentence. In conciseness, I'm gonna pick the short one. Try it, read it beginning to end. If it sounds good, you just pick it and move on. And I know that some of you might think that sounds a little bit crazy. It works, and I can promise you, which you'll see because I took all of my snapshots from one practice test here in a minute. If it works, you pick it and you move on. Don't start reading the next one. Don't start reading the next longest because then we're going to start to fall back into second guessing. Well, maybe we need more detail. Maybe it needs to be elaborated on. Absolutely not. ACT wants short and sweet. So if it works, it's grammatically correct, pick it and move on. If not, then we go to the next shortest and then to the next shortest. Occasionally it's going to be the longest one because the other ones are obviously wrong, but more often than not, it's going to be on the shorter side or just flat out the shortest option available. It's uncomfortable, but trust us, you won't, if you use it, you won't have to read so many of those other sentences with the answer choices. So you're saving yourself a lot of the energy that your brain's going to need to sustain for this 3-ish, give or take, hour test. So that's the conciseness rule. Sentence separation. So I call it sentence separation. Whenever we're doing ACT prep, I just prefer to not use formal grammatical terms and we just kind of throw out something that's going to stick. So sentence separation, how we separate two complete thoughts. Some schools use sentences and fragments, some use independent and dependent clauses. So what we're looking at is how to separate two independent clauses or two complete thoughts. First one, when I ask, is usually everyone knows the period, obviously. The one that a lot of high school students kind of admit struggling on is that semicolon. So semicolon is used interchangeably with a period. And if you look down at the little diagram on the screen, you can see all my squiggles. So each squiggle, I put a little S above it, that just represents a sentence. So option 1, you can use a period to separate two complete thoughts. Option 2, you can use semicolon. It's used the same way. You can use comma and a conjunction like and or but. You can use a transition word like however or therefore, but you would put a semicolon in front and a comma after. You also could use a colon. The ACT loves this. They put it on typically once a test because it's not a typical way that we use colons in our writing. Typically, we're going to use them only for lists and only if they're necessary. Hyphens as well. So we also can hyphenate and kind of tack something on at the end, which is rarely used, but occasionally can be. So these are all of our different ways. They will never ask you to pick between these. So if they have all of the words exactly the same, completely identical, and they have a period and a semicolon as the choices, both of those are the wrong answer. They will never make you pick between them because they mean exactly the same thing. So I just have students kind of study and memorize this. So when you are looking and skimming the answer choices, if you see a period or a semicolon, that's a big red flag to just take a time out and be like, okay, hang on. Let me look at the front half, whatever's before it, kind of cover up the back. Let me look at the back half. Do I have two complete thoughts? So I kind of have them like circle the punctuation in question and then look before it, look after it, and just decide right off the bat, do I even have two complete thoughts? Because if I don't, then I'm going to ditch any option like a period or a semicolon that would represent the way to split up two complete thoughts. So sentence separation is what I call it. Just a reminder, we cannot use a comma to separate two complete thoughts. I know a lot of students get hung up on that one also. So yes, semicolon, no comma. And if you see any of those in the answer choices, not so much commas, but period or semicolon or a comma conjunction, just take a pause and just try to identify if you even have two complete thoughts or not. And I'll show an example of that one too. All right, comma rules is my third big rule. So these are the three that are going to get a nice most likely to get a nice boost in the score. The conciseness usually applies anywhere from like 6 to 12 questions. I'm kind of just ballparking that in all the years of doing this per test. So it's definitely a go-to strategy. Commas, we see 3 to 5 questions per test that this rule typically applies for. In sentence separation, there's usually 2 or 3 of those as well. That's an average. I've seen tests with many more and tests with fewer. So comma rule on the ACT. So we're not going to go formal grammar. We're just going ACT comma rule. Kind of like conciseness. Don't add words if you don't need to. Don't add commas if you don't need to. So when you're skimming the answer choices, try the one without any commas first. And then I want you to read it really robotically to see if it sounds okay, kind of mush it together fast. Like I'll come up with an example and kind of model that. If it doesn't sound terrible, read it again. If it doesn't make you cringe or go like, I really don't like that, it doesn't have to sound great because we're trained to put commas in. But if it doesn't sound awful, you pick that one and you move on. If it's not obvious that you need to put a comma in there, just pick it and move on like we did with conciseness. If it does sound awful and it's very obvious that you need to have a comma or you need to break it up, the next one, actually, in this case, unlike conciseness, you're going to look for the option with 2 or 3 commas. And we're kind of looking for that scenario of an appositive phrase. Some students know what that means. Some need a refresher, or the school hasn't used that term. But that's where we're kind of offsetting a descriptive phrase with 2 commas. And I put an example over to the right. I know it's a lot of squiggles, but that usually works best for everyone's brains. So at the very top, that yellow phrase with the green X through it, that's kind of that descriptive information. If you see the example, John, the boy with brown hair, likes soccer. Do we need to know that John is a boy with brown hair? We do not. If we directly connect John with likes soccer, John likes soccer. Do I have a complete thought? I do. I have a subject, I have a verb, I'm good. That descriptive phrase is like just bonus information, and that's going to be offset with 2 commas. Look for those. Sometimes they'll put those in there and they'll also throw in a little interjection word like the boy with brown hair, but blue eyes, comma. So there's like 2 commas within the commas. They like to get a little crazy with it, which is why I put 2 to 3 plus commas. Look for that first, and just kind of, that's where I like to encapsulate kind of the entire sentence with those 2 parentheses and really just get the visual of it and see if there's a portion of it that's descriptive that we can just draw a line through or kind of parenthesis off so that we could try to connect the part before and after to see if we have a complete thought with the descriptive phrase in the middle. That's kind of what we want our eye to be trained to look for. I did make a note, kind of that third little point on my diagram. Those 2 offsetting commas are interchangeable with hyphens and parentheses. So the ACT will use, in both tests really, but they will use hyphens like this frequently. So kind of the hyphen rule on the ACT is if you see one hyphen, look for another one and see if it's this scenario where it's offsetting kind of a descriptive phrase or added bonus information. The last one you're going to try is the movement around of a single comma. So it's rarely going to be that you're just plucking a comma once in the middle. It can happen, but typically it's going to be the no comma option or that we're offsetting something. Or if they're adding a single comma, maybe there's another comma somewhere else in the sentence that's not in the underlined portion. So just that's why we like to look at the big picture view of the whole sentence when we're kind of analyzing and assessing how to punctuate. So my last bullet point on here is really just to start to take note of how they're using those appositive offsetting phrases, but also how they're using kind of a lead-in phrase. I wish I had time to do a bunch more examples of these, but an introductory phrase such as, looking beautiful in her white flowing gown, comma, the bride walked down the aisle. The sentence is the second part, the bride walked down the aisle. The introductory clause is kind of that fragment portion that isn't necessary, but is bonus information. It's just placed at the front of the sentence. So that's like a lead in or an intro clause. They love to write with those. And sometimes you can actually just eliminate that if it's not in the underlined part and just start your sentence after it. That's for some of the more kind of advanced work, but just pay attention to how they're using it because that comma is really just like setting off some lead in information. It's not going to be part of a descriptive phrase. And that's why I put this in here to talk about it. Just take a moment to notice if it's part of a lead in phrase, then generally it's not going to be part of offsetting a description. And that sometimes it's just the sentence behind it as a full sentence. I don't have my chat window open, but if there are questions in general, I know Amanda's on too, so she can just kind of like jump in and let me know if something pops up in the chat. I'll try and just like hover over it to see if you guys have any specific questions. So English wise, the English and the math sections are, we talked about this in our first session, a little bit easier to boost the score in because of all the concrete strategies and some content. Um, the reading and the math tend to be, or the reading and the science sections tend to be more variable, just dependent upon luck of the draw of the content that you get that day. Sometimes reading comprehension or like the level of interest they have in the passage can get in the way. So I spend usually a little bit more time on the English and math sections just because there's a lot more there to cover and go over. And the reading and the science are a lot more practice and strategy based. So let me run through some examples. So nobody said it was going to be pretty, but since you can write on the test, it should be a mess by the time you're done because I want on all 4 sections, not just math, to have visual cues, notations, crossing off, parentheses, everything. This top example on here is just kind of showing how I want to use those parentheses to kind of show the beginning and the end of a sentence. This is also an example of the comma rule. So, and of the lead-in phrases, which I highlighted in yellow. So in 1948, we don't really need that information. It's just kind of introductory. And then in the pink, we start with the sentence. Graduate students Norman Woodland and Bernard Silver took on a problem that had troubled retailers for years. And then colon, how to keep track of store inventory. So again, the colon and the afterthought is bonus information at the end. Doesn't need to be a sentence, can be a sentence. Because we talked about how that in the sentence separation could be used, a colon could be used to separate two complete thoughts. So when we read this, we're going to ditch the commas, which is why I put little slashes, and we're going to do it kind of robotic. Graduate students Norman Woodland and Bernard Silver took on a problem that had troubled retailers for years. It's fine. We do not need the commas. Almost every student wants to go in and pop commas in there because we think we need to offset their names, but the names are not a descriptive phrase. We're actually just kind of labeling the graduate students, and there's a rule around that too. So if the label comes before the name, you do not need commas. But if we said Norman Woodland and Bernard Silver, comma, graduate students at the University of Illinois, comma, took on a problem that had troubled retailers for years, that's when we would actually have to offset the descriptive phrase because it's describing the people. If you didn't follow that, if you're a student watching this, don't worry about it. I know some students have that question as to differentiate between the two. In this case, we're just carrying on. Graduate students Norman Woodland and Bernard Silver took on a problem that had troubled retailers for years. We do not need, that doesn't sound awful. Do we love it? You might not if you like commas, but you don't need them in this case. You're going to pick the no comma option, which in this situation is letter C because there's actually no commas at all present. So that's the one we tested. We're not going to read A, B, and D. We're just going to circle C. We're going to move on. Let's see here. Oh, I think on the bottom one, I was just showing an example of the parentheses, marking it off, and then that lead-in phrase. At the Scottish Storytelling Center, it's also number 6, an example of commas. So if we skim the answers real quick and just say what's different, we have the hyphen. So we could pause for a minute and look for another one to see if something's being offset, but it's not, or if it's 2 hyphens offsetting a description, and it's not. And we're going to now say, well, the difference in these last 3 answer choices is that we're just moving a comma or taking it away. So the one that takes it away in this case is F. And so we're going to say, at the Scottish Storytelling Center, and then pause. A dragon crafted from the pages of a mystery novel was found nesting in a window. Nice and fast. Do we have to pause and have a comma there? We do not. And so that's where we want to kind of read it quickly without the comma to see if it sounds okay. And if it does, we just circle that answer, we move on. Okay, note at the top of the next slide, conciseness does include delete and omit. So if we were to delete or omit or get rid of anything in the underlined portion, that's obviously going to be the shortest answer because we just got rid of all the words. So just kind of keep that in mind. The next several examples, so 2 on this page, are examples of the conciseness rule. So if we look at number 18, option J, to delete it, we're going to try that first. We're going to read it from beginning to end. I highlighted this one in yellow. So I was traveling, and the next question actually has this by canoe, so I'll fix it. I was traveling by canoe on a group tour through the renowned glowworm grotto of New Zealand's Waitomo Caves. Sounds fine. It's a sentence. We have subject, we have a verb. We're going to pick it, letter J, move on. I know that sometimes we're like, oh, maybe we need to transition into it. We don't. It's a complete thought. We can just pick letter J and move on. Same with number 20. We're going to look at the choices. So this is not a delete choice, but it definitely, if you look at letter F and we kind of skim what's underlined there for number 20, it's very long, right? So if that was all typed up over the no change, that's going to be the longest option. We're not going to try that first. We're going to jump down to letter J because it only has 3 words. And that's kind of how literal we're being about it. So we're just going to put be utterly dark, which I wrote in there in the pink section. Were it not for the twinkling light of these Arachnocampa luminosa, a species unique to New Zealand and abundant in these caves, this meandering subterranean passageway would be utterly dark. And so it takes some practice to kind of read with that inflection. I know some students struggle with that, or we need to read it a couple times to get it. Or I would even take a pen and just a species unique to New Zealand and abundant in these caves. I would just cross it off because that's in a positive, that's descriptive. It's just distracting us from what we're looking at, which is, can we just close the sentence with this short little be utterly dark? And we can. So since it made sense and they can read it once or twice just to confirm, like, oh, that sounds pretty good, we're going to circle letter J, we're going to move on. Another conciseness option, I'm not going to read them all to you, I'll just leave them in the slideshow. The shortest one, I kind of wrote it up there in this case, is A. We read it beginning to end, it works, we move on. Same thing, 59 happened to be letter A, the first one again. We read it through, it's a sentence, we circle it, we move on. So you can see this is all in one test, how much more quickly we're going to move through some of these by just applying that conciseness rule. It doesn't mean just pick the shortest one and don't read it and move on. But if you err on the side of picking the shortest, you will likely get far more correct. So I would say certainly you've got to read it to make sure that it works and then kind of go from there. So 42, just yet another one. This is also one I put in here for an example of how they split it between pages. So that's why it's always kind of, this is, I think, the bottom of one page and the top of another. So it's just important to use those parentheses to kind of keep our eye focused on the entire sentence as a whole before making any choices. Okay. I left 3 more in here. I just put the letter C, conciseness, conciseness, conciseness. If you look at them, you can see each one has a very relatively obviously shorter or short choice. And so we're going to try those. I think in all 3 of those cases, the shortest answer is the correct answer. So we tried it, we read it, we moved on. We're saving ourselves so much time and brain energy by being confident in moving to the next question that we're going to be able to hopefully be more focused and energetic in the sections that follow. Okay, so these I put in here as examples of the strategy we talked about called sentence separation for number 23. And so if we're looking in pink, there's a period and there's a comma conjunction, and in the letter A underlined part, there's a semicolon. So that's telling me right off the bat, I have to decide what I've got going on. Do I have 2 complete thoughts? So for this purpose, I highlighted one in green, part of it in green and part of it in yellow. So that's kind of what we're assessing. So is the part in green a complete thought? If we read it, yes, it is. If we look at yellow, via a cellular chemical reaction, not a complete thought. So if I have a sentence and a fragment, or an independent and dependent clause, however you think of it, can I separate that with a period? No. A semicolon? No. A comma conjunction? No. Those are all for 2 complete thoughts. The only choice here that works is the no punctuation in letter D. So it's kind of just completely changing the lens with which you look at these. So instead of just reading and reading and reading the answer choices with each option, that's a long sentence, or a long one sentence in this case. So it's going to take a lot of time. And then we start second guessing which one sounds better. Now we have a rule that we're going to apply to these. Let's see, conciseness. On 24, conciseness will help us to choose from F and J. And then you'll notice the differences in letters F and J, it's or no, I'm sorry, not it's, all, no change, all or each. So it's plural or singular. And then we're just kind of looking back for cues and we see the word it, and it's can only refer to each. We wouldn't say all of them if it's just one thing. So we're trying to kind of just match that up. That's a strategy we didn't talk about. I just don't have time to do all of them. So just wanted to make a little note of that. Again, another example of sentence separation here in number 30. So we see that semicolon or the colon, and it's a red flag to check and see if we have 2 complete thoughts. This one I added, I think, for the comma rule. So you'll see that letter A in this case is the choice with no commas. I place this clipping into the basket next to me and crouch under the rose bush. Fine, we don't need to make any pauses. So we're just going to pick letter A and we're going to move on. If letter D was the choice without commas, we would pick letter D, put it in. If it sounds good, we're going to move on. The strategy I've used twice now, kind of in going through these examples, if you noticed, is if there's a second underlined portion within that sentence, and it's kind of an obvious one that you know the answer is right, sometimes I go ahead and just write it in. I did it with the other slide with the word by, and then I did it on this one just because it makes it easier to catch whether or not it sounds awkward or if it's okay to leave it without those commas. And then, yes, okay, so this is my last one for English, then we'll jump into math strategies. If there's a question in front, so we didn't talk at length about this, but I gave you some strategies. I want you to directly match the keywords in the question. So I kind of highlighted those in pink. So we're looking for something to emphasize the idea that they found the comment peculiar. So we want to emphasize peculiar, emphasize peculiar. So this is what we kind of want to be repeating in our heads. And then we're going to skim, and we're not going to go back to the passage and overthink it. We're just going to look at the words and say, which one of these makes me think peculiar? Or which one would make me, what's a reaction I would have if something were peculiar, right? So, oh, I had been there before. Not really peculiar. Surprised. I was hesitant. Yeah, that's something I would do if things were peculiar. I'd be surprised and I'd hesitate. They had a notepad. Nothing peculiar about that. Oh, I agreed. Nothing peculiar about that. So you can kind of see I circled the keywords, and I would call that kind of like direct matching the keywords to the answer choice that best fits what they're asking you to do. Any questions about the English? If you want to throw them in the chat, I don't see anything in there right now. So I know that we're recording this. I'm fully aware of how fast I talk, and my apologies. I should have apologized in advance. I feel like if you can go back and rewatch it, there's just a lot of good stuff we want to get through here that I have had students do kind of like the hour and 15-minute crash course and boost their score by several points, which, if we're able to kind of internalize and apply these things, we should expect to see some nice gains. Okay, math section is what we're going into next. Obviously, the math section has a lot of content in it. So that's going to be a big component, right? So we really do just need to have some of that math. Some of the math that's important to brush up on is just going back to percentages, ratios, fractions, common denominators, things, decimals, things that we just haven't had to do for a while. You can use a calculator on the test. A TI-84 is acceptable. So you can and should be using that even for the most basic math, because we have a lot of kids making simple mistakes and then kind of kicking themselves later because they just didn't type it into the calculator. On the math section, a big reminder again with mindset. So many of them are easier than they look. It's a mess full of word problems, and a lot of students are not comfortable with that. I just want you to keep reminding yourself it's a lot easier than it looks, and stay in a good mindset. You can break it down. Bullet point number 2, go to the end of the question. So if it's and a lot of them are, if it's a long word problem, go to the very last sentence or question and find out what they're even asking you for before you go back up and read all the details. But otherwise, we're reading all the details and facts, reading the question, having to think about that, and then go back and read all the details and facts. And it's just not a good use of time. Typically, there's 60 questions on the math test. Typically, the first 20 are a little bit on the easier side. There's a couple harder ones and some old stuff that we haven't seen for a while. Geometry is another thing to brush up on, just circles, area, perimeter, angles of a triangle adding up to 180, parallel lines. Those are some things that students, some of them either haven't seen or just don't remember. So the first 20, a little bit in the easier side. The middle ones are mixed. The last 10 to 15, depending on the test, tends to be on the harder side, but there's some easy ones thrown in there. So I hate to generalize. It's just I want to prepare students so that you guys know towards the end, there's going to be on this test somewhere some math that you haven't seen before, or some questions that you don't know how to do. For the most part, there might be a couple or a few. So that's okay. You can use strategies, you can use logic, you can use your calculator. You can solve these any way you like. This isn't like math class if you had a teacher who said you have to do it this way, however you want, right? And I'll remind you of that again in a minute. But there are going to be some things you haven't seen, and you just got to do your best with it. Trying to manage your time is going to be a challenge for some students too, because the 60 minutes goes by pretty quick on the 60 questions. Being careful not to get stuck in one. Sometimes, you'll hit a question and think like, oh, I could figure this out. I know I can. And get locked into it for a few minutes, but now we've burned a few minutes that we could have used to get more of the easier questions right. So I like to have you guys use easy, medium, hard. So if it's relatively easy, you can do it pretty quickly, just go ahead and do it. If it's a medium, that's one that we would categorize as I could figure this out if I had time. Like I know I could figure it out. I could use logic or I'd remember it, but it's going to take me some time. Just put a little M next to it on the test if you're comfortable managing a test like this. And then if you get to a hard one, you look at it, it's like a foreign language. You have no idea what it means and you're not going to get it. You can just go ahead and bubble it in. For some people, they're comfortable with that, or mark an H or do both. Just put an H. When you finish the test, come back through to all the medium ones. So we're really just trying to manage our time being spent. So if we're not just gonna circle the ones we didn't know, because that's not gonna help us. We might end up going back to a hard one and wasting all of our time, and we would not have gotten that anyhow. So circle or mark M for medium, H for hard, do all the mediums. And if there's time, great, go back to the hard ones and see if you can figure them out. I mean, do your best. You might be able to piece together something from the back of your mind and end up getting it right. Calculator, we talked about, use it even if you don't think you need it. You can use it to solve equations. You can use it to graph two lines of to find a solution. You can use it for quadratics to find the zeros and the factors. So there's a lot of ways you can use that calculator that you maybe wouldn't necessarily do when you're doing it in your chapter in math class. Matrices as well. If you've learned matrices, you can enter those directly into the calculator when needed. The other thing I mentioned for English and for all the sections, draw something, write something, sketch something. I really, really push kids, not just showing your work mathematically, but if it's a word problem, make some visual representation. Don't worry if it's right or wrong, and I'll show you a quick example of that. Just start writing notes to yourself. And sometimes a lot of the times that's gonna be enough for you to kind of look at it visually and then, oh, I see what they want me to do. And then you can start moving in the right direction. Like I mentioned, you can do these any way you like. You can use logic and reasoning. You can, take your calculator and be like, oh, if they did this 25 times, plus 5, plus 5, plus 5, plus 5. It doesn't matter. You don't have to write a formula for it. Just get the answer. The prep book, like I said, for the math, really helpful when they put those answer explanations for each individual question. So this is the one, yes, this is the one I use. I think that's actually a live link when we share out the slides. It's just on Amazon for like $30, but it has 6 full practice tests. It used to be 4, then 3, then 4, then 5. I think this year it has 6. So tons of opportunities to practice. You can jump around. Definitely use those reading ones if that's a challenge. Math, obviously, the more exposure you get, the better. So, which is true of all 4 sections. So that's the book I use, and that's why. Study guides, we talked about, make your own study guide for all 4 sections, but especially for the math section. As you look things up, use Google Images. Google the instructions, how to factor with a coefficient or how to graph a quadratic or whatever it might be. Write that on your study guide so that you're kind of studying it right before you go into the test. And then we'll go through a couple here. I don't have quite as many screenshots because you can see how the English is just very, very strategy based as well. With the math, it's going to be a lot of content, but I just on these 2 kind of highlighted just to illustrate how much text is written and how much information is given in front of the part where they actually ask the question. So if you jump to the part where they ask the question, after all the deductions, how much of Thomas's pay for the week remains? Now you're thinking to yourself, okay, I got to figure out, they're going to deduct things. What's left? All right, cool. Now let me go back up and read the problem and start plucking the information that I need. It just makes it a little bit less overwhelming. Something else that I just wanted to point out that they love to do, they love ratios. So anytime you're comparing 2 units, or you're converting, just pay attention. In this case, you notice number 33 has the word feet, but the scale drawing is in inches. So going back up to kind of see what that ratio would be in setting up a proportion. They absolutely love to use those on the ACT. They usually show up like 3 to 5 times on any given test in some way, shape, or form that you're going to be using a ratio or a proportion to solve. So just pay close attention to the units because lots of times they'll put the answer in the other unit, of course, to try to trip you up. All right, visual examples. So number 37, this was just an example for 37 with my writing on the left. I just wanted to show what you could write to yourself. That's not some fancy mathematical notation. It was just my brain saying, okay, I need to decode or translate this more simply. I need the probability of day 1 and probability of day 2. Okay, cool. Now I can go back to my probability rules and remember that I have to multiply the 2 together for and, add them together for or. Okay, got it. And then I can write my formula and do the work. For number 6, another example, just again, go to the end of the question first, kind of set the problem up. So for each club, we're looking at how many books need to be read for the charges to be equal. So we want to do some work for ABC to calculate it, do some work for the easy book club, but in the end, I want to put that equal sign to show that that's what I'm really looking for at the end of the day. And then I can go back up and get my details later. Something else on the math test they usually do a couple times, partial solving. So a lot of students will look at this and either they do or don't remember absolute values. But if we remember, we have to get the absolute value alone and then move the 3 over, and then we've got to set up 2 equations. A lot of students automatically power all the way through it and they're like, okay, cool, X is 2, yay. And they get the, think of whatever the answer is, they get it. But you'll notice that the multiple choice options are not giving you a single number. So what they did is they actually stopped part of the way through the process, and they want you to match up which answer actually correlates to a step in the process of solving, not the actual solution itself. So just be careful of those. Look really quickly, like we did for English, skim the answer choices to see what format or what units or what step of the process that they're kind of laying out there for you, so you know what you have to match up. Here's a great example of one that's not as hard as it looks. They do this all the time where they'll put some kind of crazy formula in, and it's a real formula, right? But most students have not learned statistics at this level. Like 99% of high school juniors probably have not taken a stats class. I'm maybe exaggerating, but I think I've only worked with one who is a junior or two in the hundreds and hundreds of kids I worked with over the years who has been enrolled in stats their junior year. So there are kids who are enrolled, but at this point in the year, probably haven't covered a lot of this. So when we look at this, everyone kind of panics and says, I've never seen this before. Anytime they give you a crazy formula that you haven't seen, just stop for a minute, remind yourself it's not as hard as it looks, and then think, you know what, they gave me the formula and I'm seeing some equal signs down there. Maybe I just got to plug stuff in. And I color coded this one just to really drive that point home. They told me what 3 of those numbers represented. So if you look at the bottom, we're really just solving 2 equals x minus 78 over 6, which most students can look at that algebraically and do with no problem. So try not to get overwhelmed or frustrated, and just remind yourself it's not that bad. Let's see. Yep, here's another example, minutes and hours, just kind of those conversions. Watch out for your units. They love to use conversions and ratios. And that's what I got on the math. We could go through math for hours on end, but the big thing will be the more practice tests. If you're prepping on your own, the more practice you can do, the more you can kind of look at those questions and the content they're asking about, and then go back and look it up and look up the rules and write down the formulas, the better off you're going to be in conjunction with some of these strategies for actually approaching it. Okay, I'm going to roll through reading and science. Got about 10 minutes left from our hour that we set aside. I can do it in 10. If I run a little bit over and you have to hop off, feel free. I know that we're recording, but I'm going to try and keep it close. But the reading and science really are a lot of strategy, and then just getting to know the types of questions, which I put samples of here into the presentation. So reading, practice, practice, practice. Some kids, it's natural to them. They're great with reading comprehension. It's not a problem. Most kids struggle in some capacity with some of the boring content that they throw onto these tests. But the more practice you do, the more you're going to pace it, be successful in pacing. Most students find that it's a tight timeline because you have 40 questions in 35 minutes. So it's 10 questions over 4 passages. So it's pretty quick. The majority of students do not have time to read the passage. So I suggest you read the titles. Everybody forgets, but sometimes you can answer a question about the main idea just by looking at the title of the passage, and then play with the approach that works for you. The first passage generally is more of a story, like a fiction or a prose fiction. That one, if you have to read one, is usually the best one to read all the way through. And then the rest of them, I specifically or particularly advise that you play around with skimming. If you're good at skimming, some students struggle to do that and to pull out keywords, and that's okay too. You can play around instead with reading the introduction and then just kind of reading the topic sentence of the middle paragraphs and then reading the conclusion, because that's going to give you enough of a snapshot to know kind of where to look for information. Whether you read it or not, you're going to have to go back to the passage for information. So that's why I don't advise reading the whole passage first, unless you absolutely have to, but it's going to be a time crunch. You're going to have to go back and forth between the questions in the passage again and again anyhow. So it's better sometimes to just kind of get the main idea and then get to the questions and go back. When it comes to the questions, there's inference questions, things that you have to draw your own conclusions, kind of about what the author might have thought or the main idea was. And then there's facts or questions that are asked about things you can actually find in the passage. And I'll show you a couple of those. Big strategy for the reading is making sure, they like to kind of trip you up, all parts of the answer are true. So down at the bottom for this question number 14, I just kind of highlighted it. This is a very short example, but lots of times they'll say, oh, he was feeling very sad and upset because he loves attending parties and talking to people. So there's 2 components to that answer. Maybe he was feeling sad and upset and everyone's like, oh yeah, that's the answer, and they circle it. But then the second part, he loves parties and talking to people. No, he doesn't. Maybe he was sad for some other reason. And earlier in the passage, it talked about how he doesn't like being around people. So check both parts of the answer are true and even put like a little check mark next to it. They really try to trip you up on that, assuming you're going to read the first part and be like, yeah, that's it. And then circle it and move on. So the second part of that kind of two-part answer choice sometimes negates that as an option altogether. We talked about this in the English, focusing on the keywords and the actual questions. Same thing with the reading section, just always saying, okay, is the passage actually doing what they're asking about or telling me that I need to do here? And then matching those keywords. The examples I put in here for reading, if you look over to the right, the 15 and 16 I pulled, again, the keywords here. So if we're looking at main purpose of the third paragraph in lines 13 to 22, so if we go over to the left, I put those on there. Pulling out those keywords and really just kind of like dramatically emphasizing. So is it that it shows why he preferred rhythm and blues? Is it that the parents disapproved? Is it he's a prodigy? Is it his inspiration? Like, what was it? And then we go back and we look at the keywords kind of highlighted. And this is a skill, right? So it takes practice, but really pulling out those main ideas. It talks about him being fascinated, listen to music. His brother brought a guitar and he sat down and got addicted. That's more so about his inspiration. Is it why he liked rhythm and blues? No. Is it anything about his parents disapproving? Not a word about the parents was in there. Is it talking about him being a prodigy? Well, it didn't necessarily say he was good at it. It just said that he played and got addicted. So that's more the inspiration. Like, wow, I listened to some music and my brother brought me a guitar. So it's kind of learning to make those keyword connections. And then if you want to look at number 16 later, you can. Basically same idea. We're just kind of trying to focus on some keywords and some big picture from the paragraph, and then asking ourselves, well, is it really saying this? Is it really because he was better at playing music? And that should help to eliminate a lot of those answer choices. 28 and 29 I put in as kind of the opposite. So these are not as much inference, drawing conclusions, main ideas. These are the ones where the passage is actually going to directly state it. And you'll notice it says the author directly refers to. So you're looking for something, and I highlighted these both in green, that pretty much states one of those answer choices. The hard part about these is it just sometimes takes a long time to go back and find that part of the passage. So it's a time burner. The upside is you're going to be guaranteed to get it right if you can find it. Same with number 29. It says, is it just as important? That's the answer that matches, as much as any other written document. They're basically kind of saying that in the passage itself. So those you can look back on. That's really it for the reading. There is not a magic answer on the reading section. A lot of students just feel more comfortable or less comfortable with reading comprehension. And I can say that a lot of practice, getting to know the test, getting to know the question types, and then reading those answer explanations can really kind of help you get to know the writers of the test so that that becomes more comfortable. And this is our last section, flying through. So science section, they call it science, not science. It's a bunch of scientific information that looks confusing and crazy and is frustrating for students, but it's not at all about the content at all. So please don't try to understand the content. You'll actually probably, and I don't have time to tell the story. My background is I was a high school biology teacher. So we would do some ACT prep and have this great story about how the PhDs in the room were taking some practice questions and had trouble getting through the practice ACT test because they were over analyzing all the data. That is not what we need to do on this test. It's not about the content. It's about logic, reasoning. Can you analyze the data? Can you read a graph? Can you read the axis and the labels? Can you predict the trend where the line is going? There are typically, it used to be one, now it's sometimes 1, 2, or 3 actual science questions on there out of the 40 questions in the science section over 7 passages. So it might be something like, which is the correct equation for photosynthesis? Either you know it or you don't. There's no science studying that you can do to prepare for this. They might throw a pedigree on there from biology, or look at something that you or hope that you remember how to do like a balance the coefficients in a chemical equation. Either you're going to remember it or you're not. There's not any like studying of science that's going to be a good use of your time here on those. And it's not very many questions on this test that have anything to do with the actual science. So there's one passage of the 7 that's reading comprehension. Just use the reading comprehension strategies for that one. Same with math, go to the end of the question first, especially with the science section too, because all of the verbiage and the language they're using can be confusing. Drawing, writing, underlining, drawing lines, extending it, circling the axes, the more you write on this test, the better. And then I like to personally translate the questions and just kind of oversimplify it. And if they're, phrasing it in a long sentence, she's like, no, wait a minute. They're just asking me to figure out what happens to carbon dioxide when the oxygen goes up. Okay, let me go to the graph, right? So you're kind of like decoding what they're asking for so that you can get to the data and actually give them the answer. Again, we're looking for trends and patterns in the data, making sure that if it's a table and you're looking like as the table goes down, the numbers are going down. If like the dates are out of order, just make sure you kind of reorder them yourself as you're looking for those patterns, and that'll make more sense later. Mindset. Can't say enough about mindset. I have some kids where I've only worked with them in the science section on their mindset, and these couple of tips here today, and that's all I've given them, and their score has jumped up like 4 or 5 points, and sometimes more, because it's all about the mindset and the intimidation of what this test looks like, because it looks complicated, scientific, and confusing, even for kids who love science. So don't overthink it. Catch yourself. If you start really trying to understand that science, just pause, sit back a little bit. Nope, I'm thinking too much about this. I got to look at the trends and the patterns. Try not to get into the complexities of the data. Oh no, it's really small. Sorry, I forgot to enlarge this. So hopefully you can zoom in when we share this with you. But the idea here is going to be very much just translating. If they say figure 1, go to figure 1, circle it. If they're asking you to look at species M, circle species M, find where it is. Look at the labels. They're looking at nickel concentration on the bottom as it goes up. So like follow along with what's happening, and that's going to help you. I know I use highlighters, which I wish you could use on the test, but you can still follow it with your pencil to kind of really drive home. Okay, you can see on here. I also use the translation strategy because I wanted my brain to think, okay, as nickel's going up, what's happening to the iron of species M? I got to find the line that is iron of species M, and then you just follow it and it's going down. So a lot of these are so much easier than they look, but you got to take the time to break it down, find it correctly, and kind of follow it on the graph. Okay, so it looks like what I was putting on my slides, finishing them before I presented tonight, and I'm seeing I didn't get to like zoom and separate. So I'll fix them real quick when I hop off, just so you guys can see them a little bit better. But I want to point out a pattern. So I'm sorry these are overlapping, but on the left-hand side, you can see there's kind of crazy color coding happening. The reason why I did that is because I want you to see the pattern in that choice A and choice C have the same back half, and choice B and D have the same back explanation portion. And then A and B are both saying greater, C and D are both saying less. It's a pattern they follow all the time. You'll see it followed, like number 9 and number 12 follow that same pattern. Something that I've talked about before in reading section, English section also, I want to make sure that you're reading the back half first and just saying, okay, let me see here. First of all, I want to go look at the graph. Did the concentration of CO2 in the Diet Coke actually decrease? Because for A and D, they're both saying decrease. For A and C are decrease, B and D are increase. I just go to the graph, and either the CO2 is increasing or decreasing by looking at the graph. So I can ditch 2 of those answers right off the bat just by looking at the graph without even reading the question. So if you see that pattern, I don't even read the question first. I just go to the back half, go to the data and see which one's true, get rid of 2 answers. Then we're going to go back and look at if it's greater or less than and actually gather the information that they're looking for, if that makes sense. So that's a great strategy that will help on several of the questions because they love that pattern on the ACT. Okay, number 8 on the upper left. Actually, I think I zoomed in on it over here on the right. I'm just in slide mode, so I can't fix it. So question number 8 corresponds to the table down below. And you can kind of just see where we're writing notes to try to match up and insert it. It wasn't a data point that was on the graph, so we had to kind of insert it below the graph. So I'll get you guys a better visual of that one. My apologies on that, because I clearly just didn't drag my last slides over. And though that was the last slide, so I'll clean up those 2 because they were just examples of how, oh, there it is. So if we look at the left, that 60 degree, we had to kind of insert, or not 60, the 450 number and the volume in the center column was not on there. So we had to recognize that the volume was going down in the column. They're asking me to predict what's going to happen in question 8 if I had, or not in question, yeah, in question 8, 450 milliliters. I'm just going to write it down below, and I'm going to watch the trend for temperature, which is increasing. And I know that it's got to be higher than that. So we're just looking at patterns and trends. So I'll clean up these 2, and I think I just meant to split them on separate pages so that you guys could see them. So I'll fix that for you. That's all I got. So we're only 2 minutes over. I did put some helpful links in here. So SAT and ACT deadlines. I also linked up practice tests that they give online. SAT has like 7 or 8 of them now available with answer keys. The ACT only offers 1, but it's on there. I pulled from it today just as a heads up. But the ACT prep book has, and it's linked here also, it does have 6 of those. I'm not sure if my test prep calendar is linked, but that's not as relevant right now because I'm not running any big groups at the moment. So any questions for me? I did check the chat at one point. Anybody have questions about the approach, about the test? Anything I can answer for you before we're done?
Hi, Lisa. This is Ellen.
Hi.
Hannah had to jump off to run into softball practice. So, but we were talking about wondering, when should a student take a prep class, such as the ones that you offer? Should it be taken closer to junior year, or is sophomore year a good time to take that?
Yeah, so and then when you see the slides, and I can send them to you, but I know we'll send them out. The presentation that we did last time was all about like the timing of it, but I usually recommend, it totally depends on the student, but you have a lot of opportunities to take the test. So prep class wise, it depends on the kid's schedule. So sophomore year is a little early. Summer between sophomore and junior year, if junior year is crazy with just like sports activities, job, whatever, sometimes that's a better time to take like a full prep class, but ideally we're doing it during the junior year. The majority of juniors will take the test in April. That's kind of just like the standard, or February. So kind of trying to prep for one of those two as your first test, because junior year you can take February, April. You can take it earlier than that. It's just that I don't generally recommend it. I've had kids do it every which way. So I would say like a full prep class during junior year is ideal. You can start sophomore year, so some like the summer between sophomore and junior year. Some kids will do some prep and then kind of park it to the side for a while and then come back and revisit it and then just do some like tune-ups before the February and April tests. Because there are also tests in June and September of senior year. So there's a lot of opportunities. So there's no need to kind of go crazy sophomore year with it. And then the math too, a lot of them just don't have enough math under their belt to feel confident in the math section until they get like some of their junior year underway, depending on what level math they're in, if that makes sense. I wish it was an easier answer, sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Anybody else? Questions? That's kind of best of the best. That should help a lot, hopefully. I know there's a lot more that came from, but we had our full hours, so hopefully that was helpful. And then Amanda, I'll get you the slides just so we can share those. Thank you very much. If you have to hop off, yes, thank you guys so much for joining.
Thank you, everyone. I will send out all of the links and the slideshow and everything to everyone that was registered, and the video will also be on our YouTube page.
Perfect.
So, all
Great.
right. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.